Just 1 week ago, I was thrown out of my own home like yesterday's trash. Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back. Those words still burn in my memory. Sonia, my daughter-in-law, was screaming at me in the hallway where I'd hung family photos for 40 years. Her face twisted with such hatred, you'd think I was a stranger who'd invaded her home. Paul, my stepson, who I'd raised from the age of 8, stood behind her like a shadow, saying nothing. Absolutely nothing. I remember the silence that followed her outburst, the way the grandfather clock in the corner kept ticking, indifferent to my world crashing down. I'd just buried my husband Robert 3 days earlier. 3 days. I was still wearing black, still had tissues in my pocket from crying at his graveside, and this woman was telling me to disappear from the only life I'd ever known. You know what I did? I didn't scream back. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even shed a tear in front of them. I walked upstairs, packed one suitcase with my essentials, and left quietly through the front door. The same door I'd walked through as a young bride 40 years ago, full of dreams and love and hope. But here's what Sonia and Paul didn't know. Here's what nobody knew. As I stood in that bank lobby asking to make a withdrawal, I was about to reveal something big and unpredictable. If you want to see how this story of betrayal and justice unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will shock you. But first, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been treated like you were invisible by the very people you sacrificed everything for? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I have a feeling many of you will understand exactly what I went through. But to understand how I got to this moment, you need to know about the 40 years of sacrifice that led me here. The 40 years where I gave everything I had to people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient caretaker. The 40 years that taught me the difference between being loved and being used. It all started when I was 25 years old, fresh out of college with my teaching degree and stars in my eyes. I met Robert at a church social, and he was everything I thought I wanted in a husband. Handsome, charming, with a steady job at the insurance company. There was just one thing he came with: an 8-year-old son named Paul. Robert's ex-wife had abandoned them both when Paul was just 6. She'd left one morning for work and never came back. Can you imagine? A 6-year-old boy waking up to find his mother gone forever. When I met Paul, he was this quiet, wounded little soul who flinched every time someone raised their voice. My heart broke for him instantly. I thought I was getting a ready-made family. What I got was a lifetime of sacrifice that nobody would ever acknowledge. I gave up my teaching career before I even started it. Paul needed stability, Robert said. He needed a mother figure who would be there when he got home from school. So I put my dreams on the back burner and became a full-time mom to a child who wasn't even mine. For 30 years, I poured everything I had into that boy. When he broke his arm, falling off his bike, I was the one who stayed up all night in the hospital. When he struggled with math, I was the one who spent hours at the kitchen table helping him with homework. When he got into trouble at school, I was the one who met with teachers and counselors, trying to figure out how to help him. My parents left me $50,000 when they died in 1985. $50,000 that could have been my safety net, my independence, my future. But Paul needed college tuition, and Robert said we should use it for his education. It's an investment in his future, he told me. You're giving him the gift of opportunity. So I signed the papers. I gave away my inheritance without hesitation because I believed I was doing the right thing for my son. But the sacrifices didn't stop there. Paul dropped out of college after 2 years to chase some get-rich-quick scheme. When that failed, there was another business idea, then another. Each time, we bailed him out. Each time, I watched our savings disappear into his latest fantasy. Then came the drinking, the arrests, the rehab programs that we paid for, over and over again. I drove him to AA meetings, held his hand through detox, cleaned up his messes, both literal and figurative. I never gave up on him. Not once. And through it all, I never had children of my own. Robert kept saying we should wait until Paul was older, more stable. Then it was too late. My childbearing years slipped away while I was busy being a mother to someone else's child. But you know what? I didn't resent it. I loved Paul like he was my own flesh and blood. I genuinely believed that love and sacrifice would be enough. That he would grow up to be a good man who would appreciate everything I'd given him. How naive I was. The last few years were the hardest. Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and I became his full-time caregiver. 2 years of chemo treatments, hospital visits, sleepless nights watching him suffer. I held his hand through every single treatment, celebrated every small victory, and comforted him through every setback. Paul barely visited. He was too busy with work, he said. Sonia, Paul's wife, was uncomfortable around sick people. So it was just me and Robert, fighting this battle together until the very end. When Robert died, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. I'd barely slept in months. I'd lost 20 pounds from stress. But I still had to plan his funeral, handle all the arrangements, and grieve for the man who'd been my partner for 4 decades. I thought surely Paul would step up now. Surely he'd see how much I needed support. Instead, he showed up to the funeral with Sonia, who immediately started making demands. "This house is too big for you," she announced while I was still in my funeral dress. "Paul and I need more space for the kids." I was too tired to fight. Too heartbroken to argue. I just stared at her, wondering where this cruelty was coming from. But then she said something that cut me deeper than any knife could have. "You're not even his real mother. You have no legal claim to anything here. 40 years of love reduced to a legal technicality. 40 years of sacrifice dismissed with a wave of her hand. Paul needs his inheritance now, not when you die," she continued, her voice getting louder and more aggressive. "You've been a burden long enough." A burden. After everything I'd given, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd endured, I was nothing more than a burden to them. And Paul? The little boy I'd raised, the young man I'd supported through every failure and mistake? He stood there silent. He didn't defend me. He didn't remind his wife of all the times I'd been there for him. He just stood there like a coward, letting her tear me apart. That's when I knew I had to leave. Not because I was giving up, but because I finally understood that I'd been living a lie. I'd been giving my love to people who saw it as nothing more than what they were owed. I packed one suitcase with my essentials and walked out of that house with my head held high. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't even say goodbye. But what none of them knew was that I'd been planning for this moment longer than they could imagine. 5 years earlier, when Robert's health started declining, I'd quietly gotten a part-time job at Morrison, Webb & Associates, a small law firm downtown. I told Robert I was volunteering at the library, but the truth was, I was working 20 hours a week, learning about legal procedures and earning my own money for the first time in decades. Eleanor Webb, the senior partner, took me under her wing. She saw something in me that my own family never did: intelligence, capability, strength. She encouraged me to get my paralegal certification, which I did through online courses in the evenings while Robert slept. For 5 years, I'd been building a life outside of being a wife and mother. For 5 years, I'd been preparing for my independence without even realizing it. And then, while settling Robert's estate, I discovered something that changed everything. Remember that $50,000 my parents left me? The money I'd given to Paul for college? Robert had never actually spent it on tuition. He'd invested it in a high-yield account and never told me. For 40 years, that money had been growing, compounding, multiplying. $50,000 had become $2.3 million, and legally, it was all mine. Robert had hidden this from me for our entire marriage. Maybe he was protecting it for my future. Maybe he just forgot about it. But the account was in my name, and I was the sole beneficiary. Paul and Sonia thought they were kicking out a penniless old woman. What they were actually doing was setting free a millionaire who'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being used. I moved into a small apartment across town and started working full-time at the law firm. For the first time in my adult life, I was making my own decisions, earning my own money, and building relationships with people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. I had friends. Real friends who enjoyed my company and respected my opinions. I had colleagues who appreciated my work ethic and intelligence. I had a life that was mine. But I wasn't done with Paul and Sonia. Not by a long shot. They'd made one crucial mistake when they threw me out of that house. They'd assumed I was weak. They'd assumed I was broken. They'd assumed I would just disappear quietly into the night. They had no idea what was coming next. 6 months passed. 6 months of rebuilding my life, discovering who I was outside of being someone's wife or mother. I was thriving at the law firm, earning respect from colleagues who saw me as an intelligent, capable woman. My apartment was small but peaceful, filled with books I'd always wanted to read and plants I'd always wanted to grow. I was finally happy. Genuinely, authentically happy. That Tuesday evening, Eleanor invited me to dinner at Romano's, one of the most upscale restaurants in the city. It was a celebration. I'd just been promoted to senior paralegal, and she wanted to treat the team. I wore my new burgundy suit, the one that made me feel powerful and confident. My hair was perfectly styled, my makeup flawless. I felt like the woman I was always meant to be. We were seated at a beautiful table near the window, laughing about office stories and sharing plans for upcoming cases. The wine was excellent. The conversation was stimulating, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Then I saw them. Paul and Sonia walked through the restaurant entrance, dressed to the nines and laughing loudly. They were clearly celebrating something, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what it was. Sure enough, as they passed our table, I heard Sonia's voice carrying across the room. "I can't believe how much we got for that old house. The market is just insane right now." My house. They were celebrating selling my house. Sonia spotted me first. Her face went white, then red, then white again. She grabbed Paul's arm and whispered something urgent in his ear. He turned and stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. "What is she doing here?" Sonia's voice was loud enough that several nearby tables turned to look. I simply smiled and continued my conversation with Eleanor, pretending I hadn't heard her. But inside, my heart was racing. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for. The moment where I'd have to face the people who'd thrown me away. Eleanor noticed my change in demeanor. "Amelia, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just some people from my past," I said quietly. "Nothing I can't handle." But Sonia wasn't done. She started walking toward our table, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor. Paul followed reluctantly behind her, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Well, Sonia said, stopping directly beside our table. "Look who's trying to act all fancy now." The entire restaurant seemed to pause. Conversations stopped, servers froze. Everyone could sense the tension building. "She's probably spent all of Paul's inheritance," Sonia announced loudly, to no one in particular. "Look at her, eating at expensive restaurants, wearing designer clothes. She's living off money that should have gone to her stepson." Eleanor looked confused and concerned. My other colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but I remained perfectly calm. I'd learned something important over the past 6 months. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for my existence. "Excuse me," I said politely to the server who'd been standing nearby, clearly unsure what to do. "Could I have the check, please?" "Still playing dress-up, I see," Sonia sneered. "You can put on all the expensive clothes you want, but we all know what you really are. A nobody who got lucky for a few years." That's when something inside me snapped. Not with anger, but with absolute clarity. I'd spent 40 years being quiet, being polite, being invisible. I'd let people walk all over me because I thought that's what good women did, but I wasn't that woman anymore. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor in the sudden silence. Every eye in the restaurant was on me. Paul looked terrified. Sonia looked triumphant. She thought she'd won. "Sonia," I said, my voice calm but carrying clearly through the room. I raised your husband for 30 years. I buried my own dreams for his future. I gave up my career, my inheritance, my chance at having my own children, all so Paul could have the best life possible. Paul's face went pale. He knew where this was heading. I held his hand through every failure, every addiction, every mistake. I never asked for gratitude. I never asked for recognition. I just loved him unconditionally because I thought that's what mothers do. Sonia's smirk was starting to fade. But you want to know the truth about that money you're so concerned about? The money you accused me of stealing from Paul? I paused, letting the tension build. It was never Robert's to begin with. The restaurant was dead silent now. Even the kitchen seemed to have stopped working. My parents left me $50,000 in 1985. Robert invested it without telling me. For 40 years, that money grew into over $2 million. My money, my inheritance, my future that I'd forgotten even existed. Paul's mouth fell open. Sonia's face went from red to white to green. So every expensive meal I eat, every nice dress I wear, every moment of happiness I experience, it's all paid for with my own money. Money that was mine before I even met your husband. I could see the realization dawning on Paul's face. He was remembering all the times I'd supported him, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the love I'd given freely. I don't owe you anything, I continued, my voice growing stronger. I don't owe Paul anything. I've already given more than any person should be expected to give. I'm done being invisible. I'm done being taken for granted. I'm done being treated like a burden by people who should be grateful I exist. Sonia's mouth was opening and closing like a fish. She was clearly struggling to process what I'd just revealed. You can't just take everything, she finally sputtered. Paul has rights. He's Robert's son. We'll contest this legally. We'll fight you in court. I smiled then, a real smile that reached my eyes. Because Sonia had just walked right into the trap I'd been hoping she'd fall into. Oh, Sonia, I said softly. You really don't understand, do you? I have Robert's letters. All of them. If you're enjoying watching karma catch up to people who thought they could throw away a good woman, hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to reveal will absolutely blow your mind. But first, let me ask you this. Have you ever had someone underestimate you so completely that their shock when you proved them wrong was almost worth all the pain they caused? Share your story in the comments below. The color drained from both their faces. Paul knew exactly what letters I was talking about. Robert had been writing me letters for years, but especially in the months before he died. Letters expressing his regret, his guilt, his plans for my future. He knew about your manipulation, Sonia, I said, my voice steady and strong. He knew how you'd turned his son against the woman who raised him. He knew you'd try to push me out the moment he was gone. I reached into my purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. This is his final letter, written just 2 weeks before he died. Would you like me to read it aloud, or would you prefer to hear it from my lawyer? Paul stepped forward, his voice shaking. Amelia, please. Let's not do this here. Oh, but Paul, I said, my voice dripping with the kind of calm that comes from absolute confidence. This is exactly where we need to do this, in public, where everyone can see who you really are. I opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, savoring every moment of their growing panic. My dearest Amelia, I began reading. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I can only hope you found the strength to stand up for yourself the way I never taught you to. I've been a coward about Sonia's treatment of you, and I've watched my son become someone I don't recognize. Paul's face was crumbling. Sonia looked like she was going to be sick. I've made arrangements to protect you, I continued. I've changed my will. Everything goes to you. The house, the cars, the investments, everything. Paul gets nothing because he's allowed his wife to poison him against the only mother he's ever known. Sonia let out a strangled gasp. That's impossible. The will reading was for the old will, I interrupted. The one from 10 years ago. Robert wrote a new one just before he died and gave it directly to his lawyer, with instructions not to reveal it until someone tried to contest the old one. The devastating truth was sinking in. Everything they'd celebrated, everything they'd counted on, everything they'd built their future around, it was all gone. So that house you just sold, it was never yours to sell. Those investments you've been planning to spend, they were never yours to spend. You've been living in a fantasy, and now reality is crashing down around you. Paul finally found his voice. But you left. You didn't fight for anything. I left because I had dignity, I replied. But I never gave up my legal rights. I just let you hang yourselves with your own greed and cruelty. Sonia was starting to hyperventilate. This isn't over. We'll fight this. We'll prove you manipulated him. You'll what? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. You'll prove that a dying man wanted to protect the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his ungrateful son? You'll prove that he saw through your manipulation and decided to do the right thing? The restaurant was still dead silent. Everyone was hanging on every word of this real-life drama unfolding before their eyes. Face it, Sonia. You gambled everything on Paul's inheritance, and you lost. You threw away the one person who would have shared everything with you willingly, and now you have nothing. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my purse. Then I stood up, threw my napkin on the table, and looked at both of them with the kind of pity usually reserved for small wounded animals. I spent 40 years being the woman you wanted me to be. Quiet, selfless, invisible. But that woman is gone. In her place is someone who knows her worth, who won't be taken advantage of, and who has the resources to live exactly the life she wants. I started to walk away, then turned back for one final word. Oh, and Paul? That house sale you're celebrating? It's illegal. You can't sell property you don't own. I'd call your lawyer if I were you. You're going to need one. And with that, I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high, leaving behind two people whose world had just completely collapsed. The woman who'd been thrown out like garbage 6 months ago was gone forever. In her place was someone who'd learned that respect isn't given, it's taken. But my revenge was just getting started. 3 months later, justice had a way of serving itself. My lawyer, David Morrison, from the firm where I worked, handled everything with the precision of a surgeon. The illegal house sale was reversed within 2 weeks. Paul and Sonia had to return every penny they'd received, plus legal fees and penalties. The beautiful colonial home that I'd turned into a sanctuary for 4 decades was officially mine again. But here's the thing. I didn't want it anymore. Too many memories of being taken for granted. Too many ghosts of the woman I used to be. So I sold it myself, to a lovely young family who would fill it with the kind of love and laughter it deserved. Meanwhile, Paul and Sonia were facing eviction from their apartment. Turns out, when you spend money that was never yours to begin with, and then have to pay it back with interest, you find yourself in quite a financial hole. They'd been living beyond their means for years, assuming Paul's inheritance would eventually bail them out. Now, they had nothing. Sonia's reaction to losing everything was, well, let's just say it wasn't graceful. She took to social media like a woman possessed, posting daily rants about how I'd stolen Paul's rightful inheritance. She called me every name in the book, accused me of manipulating Robert on his deathbed, and painted herself as the victim of a cruel, calculating stepmother-in-law. The internet can be a brutal place, but sometimes it gets things exactly right. People saw right through her lies. Comments poured in from strangers who recognized the real story. A woman who'd sacrificed everything for an ungrateful family, and finally learned to stand up for herself. This is what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you, one person wrote. Good for you, Amelia. You deserve better. The more Sonia ranted, the more people turned against her. Friends who'd known our family for years started sharing their own stories about how I'd been treated. They remembered the times I'd helped them, the ways I'd always been there for everyone, the quiet dignity with which I'd handled years of being overlooked. Sonia's social media meltdown didn't just destroy her reputation. It destroyed Paul's career. His boss at the accounting firm saw the posts where she'd tagged him, ranting about that witch who stole our future. Professional colleagues started distancing themselves. Clients requested different accountants. When Paul finally asked her to stop posting, she turned on him too. "This is all your fault," she screamed in one particularly unhinged video. "You should have stood up to her years ago. You should have put me first." Paul lost his job 3 weeks later. His boss cited personal conduct reflecting poorly on the firm and inability to maintain professional boundaries. 20 years of building his career, gone because his wife couldn't handle losing gracefully. But you know what the most satisfying part was? I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't have to fight them or argue with them or prove anything to anyone. I just lived my life, and their own choices destroyed them completely. While they were falling apart, I was building something beautiful. I found a cottage by the lake, about an hour outside the city. It had a wraparound porch, a garden that desperately needed someone to love it, and windows that looked out over water so blue it took my breath away. The moment I saw it, I knew I was home. I bought it outright with cash. No mortgage, no monthly payments, no financial stress, just me and my little piece of paradise. The cottage became my sanctuary. I spent mornings drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. I planted flowers I'd always wanted to grow, roses and lavender and herbs for cooking. I adopted a rescue cat named Jasper, who followed me around the garden like a faithful shadow. At the law firm, I was promoted to senior paralegal supervisor. Eleanor made me her right hand, and I discovered I had a talent for training new employees and managing complex cases. My colleagues respected my knowledge and valued my opinions. For the first time in my life, I was seen as an expert, not just a helper. My weekends were filled with friends, real friends who enjoyed my company for who I was, not what I could do for them. We'd have dinner parties on my porch, book clubs in my living room, and garden parties that lasted until sunset. I was surrounded by people who celebrated my successes instead of taking them for granted. The woman who'd been invisible for 40 years had finally learned to shine. One evening, about 6 months after the cottage became my home, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of tea when my phone rang. It was Paul. His voice was quiet, defeated. "Amelia? I wanted to apologize. For everything. For not standing up for you. For letting Sonia treat you the way she did. For being an ungrateful son after everything you did for me." I listened without interrupting, watching the lake reflect the colors of the sunset. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he continued. "But I needed you to know that I remember. I remember you staying up all night when I had pneumonia. I remember you driving me to every baseball game and cheering louder than any other parent. I remember you believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." There was a long pause. "I'm sorry I forgot who you were. I'm sorry I let you down. I'm sorry I was a coward when you needed me most." When he finished, I took a deep breath. "Paul, I appreciate the apology. I really do. But I need you to understand something. I'm not the same woman who raised you. That woman gave everything she had and got nothing in return. I'm someone different now. Someone who knows her worth." "I understand," he said quietly. I hope someday you might be willing to have coffee with me. Just once, so I can tell you properly how sorry I am." I thought about it for a moment, watching Jasper chase fireflies in the garden. "Maybe someday," I said finally. "When you've learned to stand up for what's right instead of just going along with what's easy." After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I'd spent 40 years being who others needed me to be. I'd sacrificed my dreams, my money, my future for people who saw my love as something they were entitled to, rather than something precious to be cherished. I'd been thrown away like garbage by the very people I'd given my life to protect and nurture. But sometimes, being thrown away is exactly what you need to discover who you really are. I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. I learned that some people will only value you when you're useful to them. I learned that real love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller, so others can feel bigger. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to start over. At 65, I'd found my voice, my strength, my purpose. I'd built a life that was truly mine, surrounded by people who saw me as I really was. Not just a caretaker or convenience, but a woman worth knowing, worth respecting, worth loving. The family I'd chosen loved me better than the one I'd been born into, and that, I realized, was the most beautiful revenge of all. Not destroying those who'd wronged me, but building something so beautiful that their rejection became irrelevant. As I sat there in my perfect cottage with my loyal cat and my peaceful lake and my hard-won independence, I smiled. The woman who'd been invisible for 40 years had finally learned to shine. And I was never going back to the shadows again. Sometimes, the family you choose loves you better than the one you're born into. And sometimes, learning to love yourself is the most radical act of all. Today, as I sit in my garden with the morning sun warming my face and Jasper purring contentedly in my lap, I reflect on the journey that brought me here. My roses are blooming in shades of pink and cream, their sweet fragrance mixing with the lavender I planted along the stone pathway. The lake stretches out before me like a mirror, reflecting the clouds and the life I've built from the ashes of my old existence. I learned the hardest lesson of all. Some people will only value you when you're useful to them. The moment you stop being convenient, the moment you need something in return, the moment you assert your own worth, they'll discard you without a second thought. But here's what I wish I could tell my younger self, the 25-year-old woman who walked into that ready-made family with such hope and innocence. Your worth isn't determined by how much you give or how little you ask for in return. Your worth is inherent, unchanging, and doesn't need to be earned through decades of silent sacrifice. The woman I was spent 40 years believing that her value came from being indispensable to others. The woman I am now knows that her value comes from being true to herself. As I tend to my flowers and watch the seasons change over my peaceful lake, I'm filled with a contentment I never knew was possible. Every morning, I wake up in a home that's truly mine, surrounded by beauty I created, living a life I chose. No one can take this away from me because I built it with my own hands, my own money, my own determination. Eleanor stopped by yesterday with her granddaughter, a bright 12-year-old named Sophie who's fascinated by my garden. As we walked among the flowers, Sophie asked me, "Mrs. Henderson, how do you make everything grow so beautifully?" I smiled, thinking of all the wisdom that question contained. "You give them what they need to thrive," I told her. "Good soil, the right amount of water, plenty of sunlight, but most importantly, you don't let weeds choke them out." "What are weeds?" she asked. "Anything that takes away from the plant's ability to grow into what it's meant to be." Later, as I watched her run through the garden with pure joy, I realized I'd been talking about more than flowers. I'd been talking about life. For 40 years, I'd let the weeds of other people's expectations, demands, and selfishness choke out my own growth. I'd given my sunlight to others and wondered why I felt so dim. I'd poured my water into their roots and wondered why I felt so dry. But now, in the garden of my new life, I'm finally blooming. The cottage has become a sanctuary not just for me, but for other women who found themselves in similar situations. Maria, who works at the local library, comes by every Thursday for tea. She's recently divorced and learning to live alone for the first time in 30 years. Janet, my neighbor, stops by whenever she needs to talk about her struggles with her adult son, who only calls when he needs money. We sit on my porch, sharing stories and wisdom, supporting each other through the challenges of learning to put ourselves first. We're creating the kind of family that chooses to love and support each other, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care and respect. This is what healing looks like. This is what justice looks like. Not destroying those who wronged you, but building something so beautiful that their rejection becomes irrelevant. Do I think about Paul and Sonia? Sometimes. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they're still struggling financially, still blaming everyone but themselves for their situation. Paul took a job at a smaller firm for much less money. Sonia had to go back to work for the first time in years. Their marriage is strained, their future uncertain. I don't take pleasure in their suffering, but I also don't feel responsible for fixing it. They made their choices, and now they're living with the consequences. That's not cruelty, that's just life. As for me, I'm living proof that it's never too late to start over. At 65, I discovered strengths I didn't know I had. I built a career that gives me purpose. I created a home that brings me joy. I cultivated friendships that nourish my soul. The woman who was thrown away like garbage became the woman who learned to treasure herself. The woman who was invisible for 40 years became the woman who learned to shine. And I'm not done yet. I'm taking classes at the community college, learning photography so I can capture the beauty of my lake through the seasons. I'm volunteering at the women's shelter, helping other women find their voices and their strength. I'm writing my story, hoping it might help someone else who's forgotten their worth. Every day brings new possibilities, new joys, new reasons to be grateful that I finally learned to love myself enough to demand better. As I close this chapter of my story, I want to leave you with the most important lesson I've learned. I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. And sometimes the family you choose loves you better than the one you're born into. You are worthy of love, respect, and happiness, not because of what you do for others, but because of who you are. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. And if they try to throw you away, remember, sometimes being discarded is exactly what you need to discover how precious you really are. If this story has inspired you to reflect on your own worth and the people in your life, I'd love for you to subscribe and join this community of people who believe in second chances and the power of knowing your value.